So how can we now turn this into a structural directive and change the DOM structure depending on this auth status here? Well, first we need to go to the place where we use the directive. And there, as a first step, we need to change the markup a little bit. Before we start adding an asterisk here, I'll use this directive in a slightly other way on a different element. I'll add the ng template element, opening and closing, and put my paragraph between those tags and put this directive here onto ng template. Now, ng template is a special element provided by Angular, and its job is that you can use it in one of your component templates to wrap some content, in this case, this paragraph, which should not be shown on the screen initially. So whatever you put inside of an ng template will not be rendered on the screen. Instead, the idea behind ng template is that you can define some content, like this paragraph here, that can eventually be rendered onto the screen. So where you can control when exactly it should show up on the screen instead of always showing it. That's the idea behind ng template. It allows you to prepare some markup that should eventually be shown, and you can control, and we will soon control, when exactly this wrapped markup, this paragraph here, should be shown. And structural directives always need such a template, though this template can be added automatically behind the scenes if you use this asterisk, but we'll do this in a second step. As a first step, we'll use it like this because you can always use structural directives, including the built-in ngIf directive, like this, on an ng template element without the asterisk. This asterisk is just syntactic sugar for automatically adding this ng template element behind the scenes. But here I'll explicitly add it myself and then just add this directive as an attribute onto ng template. But that's important, onto ng template, not onto the element that should be rendered conditionally. So we don't add it like an attribute directive onto the element that should be changed, but instead onto a template that contains the content that might eventually end up in the DOM. So that's the first important step. The second step is then back in the auth directive class. There we now need to inject two additional things, either through the constructor or with help of the inject function, which is what I'll use here. And the first thing we need to inject here is a reference to that template on which this directive was added. So here I'll add a property called templateRef, though the name doesn't matter, and inject a value of type templateRef. And this does matter. This must be templateRef. And that is a type that must be imported from Angular. Now, when injecting a template ref, you tell Angular that this directive will be used on an ng template element and that you want to get hold of that template and therefore implicitly also of the content inside of that template. Which, by the way, doesn't have to be a single element. This could be any markup of any structure and complexity. So you can get hold of that template by injecting that template ref. And that's a super important step when building a structural directive. The last important step you need to go through is that you also must inject a so-called view container ref. Also with inject or the constructor, and by injecting the view container ref type or class to be precise, which also is imported from @AngularCore. So that's also injected here. This view container ref in the end is a reference to the place in the DOM where this template is being used. So the template ref in the end gives you access to the content of the template, you could say. The view container ref gives you access to the place in the DOM where this directive is being used, so where this template is being used, therefore, in the end. And you need both pieces of information to tell Angular where to render what. And that's what we'll do now. Instead of logging show element, I can now use this view container ref to call the built-in create embedded view method, which is in the end a method provided by Angular that will tell Angular to render some new content into a certain place in the DOM. This then needs a template ref as an argument, and therefore I'll simply pass this template ref to create embedded view. And this then tells Angular to take the content that's between those ngTemplate tags and render it in the place where this directive is used. So instead of ngTemplate in the end. Now, for that, it's also important to understand that the content between those ngTemplate tags by default is not rendered onto the screen. So this part of the template is there in your template, but won't be on the rendered page initially. Instead, it will only show up there once you call create embedded view and you pass the template ref to create embedded view. Now here in the else case, I then want to clear that rendered content. I want to get rid of it. And we can do that by calling this view container ref clear. This will remove any embedded view that has been rendered. And that's all. And that's how you create such a structural directive. With that done, and with this ngTemplate element being used like this in the app component file, if you reload, this text won't show up initially. So this paragraph, only admins should see this, does not show up here. If we inspect this page here below the form, below app auth, you see this thing here though. And that's in the end a marker for Angular so that it internally is able to find the place where this content here should be rendered if this directive decides that it must be rendered. And therefore here, if I enter admin@example.com and then admin as a password, you see the content shows up because now this paragraph was rendered here with help of our own structural directive. And if I change my login, then it disappears again. And that's how you can build and use a custom structural directive, though you can use it in a bit of a more convenient way than using ngTemplate. I did mention before that this asterisk here in front of a directive is syntactic sugar for using ngTemplate. So instead of using ngTemplate like this, you could also add your paragraph like that and add the app auth directive directly on it, but now prefixed with this asterisk, which is simply some special naming pattern Angular picks up and understands to, under the hood, create such a ngTemplate element instead. Now, what's important to understand about this asterisk is that it will not just lead to ngTemplate being added here, but that it will also automatically set up property binding as if you were using square brackets here. And therefore, the content between the quotes is now evaluated as TypeScript code instead of as a string. So here, where I want to pass a hard-coded string as a value for this input, I therefore must wrap this with single quotes so that I do create a string value in TypeScript code again. But with that, we can use this shorter syntax here to conditionally render this content here. So with that, it still works as before, but now by using this shorter syntax. And this also allows me to add some finishing touches here because I also prepared some CSS classes in advance, which have nothing to do with this directive, which are just there to make the app look a bit better. And therefore, I'll add the protected-content class to this paragraph. And then here, give this a second class name of admin. And then I'll add a second paragraph, which should be rendered for regular users. So I'll set that as a value for app auth. And then replace the admin CSS class with unauthenticated. And say regular users should see this. And last but not least, I'll add a third paragraph for guest users, where unauthenticated is replaced with authenticated, and where I'll say guest users should see this. And now only one of those 3 paragraphs should be visible at a time, depending on the user authentication status. Initially, it's the guest users paragraph, but if I log in as an admin with the credentials you find in the auth service, this changes. And if I log in as a user, this also changes. And that's how you can use your own structural directives. And most importantly, this is how you can build them.